Thanks, Helena, and thank all of you for coming back for yet another round. I think yesterday was a really good day. I think that we pinpointed the urgency, and I don't think any of us were in any doubt of that. What we also discovered is that we really do have the solutions, and that we have the solutions throughout the supply chain. But one of the things that we've discovered is those solutions aren't necessarily lined up. The financing for those solutions isn't lined up. There's a lot of work to be done in that area. So today, what we're going to be looking at is how to link those things up. And in the morning, we're really going to be looking at how to do that through financing. How finance can really accelerate this in lots of different ways. And I'm really excited to hear from a wide array of financial experts on how we can accelerate positive change. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be looking at different ways of expanding what we actually have now into the sector through efficiency measures. So everything from wind propulsion to ship design, reducing fuel consumption, and how we can use that to actually increase the true zero ship technology throughout the sector. And I keep coming back to true zero, and this goes back to the sense of urgency. We don't have time. We don't have time for blind alleyways and different directions. We need to be focused on our goal and our goal and our mission. We may have our goal and our mission here today, and in these 3 days is to look at how we can accelerate and expand to true zero. So what we are doing, our goal, is to develop a navigational chart to true zero, and we'll be doing that through our brainstorming sessions. We had some fabulous sessions yesterday. We're going to build on that today, moving forward with the ideas we came up, expanding on that. And today what I'd like us to start thinking about, which we didn't talk about yesterday, is actually looking at timelines. So we've got these great ideas. When are we going to do them? Because at the end of the day, it's all about action. This isn't a talk shop. We don't have time for a talk shop. This is an action shop. So at the end of these 3 days, we will have assigned tasks, people at your battle stations, ready to go. So that's more of what we're looking at today, is actually beginning to develop that action plan. But I'll talk about that more through the day and explain that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, Mr. Michael Parker, who is Chairman of Global Shipping at Citibank and also founder and chairman of the Poseidon Principles Association. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this stage, Michael Parker.
Thank you, Maddie. I'd also like to thank you very much, you and Brent, for the wonderful dinner we had last night, and having been very disciplined throughout dinner and not gone to the effort of packing a kilt, because I haven't worn a kilt for about 60 years. I got back to my hotel, and unfortunately outside was my chief sustainability analyst and a couple of his female employees, who of course do actually all the work for him, and he gets all the kudos. And so he insisted that I tell them everything we had discussed during yesterday, because it's so important. So we went in, and unfortunately the bar was still open. So having avoided the danger here, I succumbed very easily when I got back to my hotel. The other thing I think is Jimmy Newick or Nork, I can't pronounce him, was here, and he was probably, I don't want to disparage the Prime Minister of Greenland or the Transport Minister of the Scottish Government, but Jimmy is the chief negotiator for the Solomon Islands at the IMO. And they and the Marshall Islands have put forward this proposal for the $100 carbon tax. And this is getting traction, and I'll mention a few more things later. But in a way, what he really typifies is someone who comes from a small area that is vulnerable to climate change and is doing his best to lead from the front. And fortunately, other countries, Europe, United States, are beginning to follow him. So it makes MEPC 77, which comes after COP, actually potentially, something where decisions will get made, more positive decisions that people might have thought about. The other thing I was sort of thinking about was we had the Global Maritime Forum Summit last week in London, and that was sort of 18-hour days for 3 days. We had a panel on the first day of some very distinguished people. I can't say who they were because Chatham House rule applied in that particular event. But at the end of the panel, the facilitator asked each of them to, in one word, define what it took to actually get to zero. Not maybe as quickly as you'd like, Maddie, but to get to zero, what they needed, the shipping industry needed to do. And a ship owner who's actually doing quite a lot around new technologies, he said, crazy. You have to be crazy. And Maddie, I think that's why I call you Maddie. You have to be a visionary. You have to be someone who does it, but you also have to be someone who talks about it and gets people in a room to talk about it. And again, I'll come back to collaboration. But the other thing you need is money. It is all about the money. Without the money, whether it's coming from the private sector or comes through market-based measures from governments, it's money that will actually make this happen. Because of the technology being available to this industry, we can do this, and the question is how quickly we can do it. There was someone else on that panel who had a lot of money and is actually doing something with it, and actually already getting his people to create the zero-emission fuel engines to operate on ships that he charters. But I have to confess, I was a climate change skeptic 10 years ago, but now I'm fully engaged in working with the maritime sector to try and accelerate its decarbonisation. I never thought this issue would be so high on the agenda in my career, let alone my lifetime. But we now know we have no choice, and we have to accelerate decarbonisation. And for me, making a small contribution in that effort has been interesting and exciting. Someone out there this morning noticed my tie. This is a tie of ostriches. Half of them have heads in the sand. And I've worn this tie at every shipping speech I have ever made, and it goes back about 30 years, because always half the shipping industry has its head in its sand, and the other half doesn't. But I think we're getting to the point where if I can find a tie where all the ostrich heads are up, or at least 2/3 are up, we will actually have achieved something. But this is part of the problem with the industry. That half of the industry that would rather not talk about any of this stuff is either going to get shot up the backside with its head in the sand, or is going to have to get the head out and notice what everyone is doing, because there is no choice. And when we launched the Poseidon Principles in June 2019 with 11 signatories, we, the shipping lenders, were the first sector to give a specific framework to motivate ourselves and our clients to address the issue by aligning our portfolios to the IMO's April 2018 ambition of a 50% cut by 2050. How long ago that seems. Let me briefly take you back to how it started. Under the auspices of the Global Maritime Forum, which came into existence in 2017 out of the Danish Maritime Forum, I was asked to meet with the World Bank and the Rocky Mountain Institute, who wanted to publish a paper addressed to banks telling us which vessels we should or should not finance based on their expected CO2 emissions. Apart from pointing out that they were using out-of-date data, I had to explain that their idea would not work with us as shipping banks, as we have relationships, confidential relationships with our clients. And banks do not finance vessels on the whole as individual assets. Those who did have all disappeared, frankly. We have relationships with ship owners, with shipping companies, and we finance vessels as part of those relationships. What's very important is we don't finance a vessel because we can take security. We finance a company and happen to take a vessel as security. With the GMF, we assembled a drafting committee, which I chaired with Paul Taylor of Société Générale, who follows me today as my vice chair, which included shipping companies, advisors such as Lloyd's Register and UMass, and initially the major bulk commodity companies, of whom more later. Paul will be explaining more of the detail of how we assess our clients' emissions in the context of our portfolios, so I will leave all that detail to him. What I will say, though, that this was an initiative of responsible lenders working with responsible borrowers to set a framework for the major capital providers to the shipping industry, that is the banks. So this is very important. The banks to shipping have a unique position compared to any other industry. We are the primary capital providers. 5 years' time, that may not be true, but that is what gave us that opportunity to influence this direction. We will be judged on how we manage our business, but already recognize that the IMO's ambition needs to change. And as I've indicated already publicly, we expect to amend the Poseidon Principles ambition to 0 by 2050, early next year, once we see what comes out of COP26 and MEPC 77. But we won't wait for the IMO if they do not respond to the various calls from several governments to raise their ambition to align with the Paris Agreement. Let me talk briefly about the call to action the Getting to Zero coalition launched at the UN General Assembly in September, and which was physically handed over. The plan was to hand it to Alok Sharma in front of all the IMO ambassadors, but obviously was busy worrying about this place. But we did hand it to the Ministry of Transport physically. And I'll come back to that. But the Getting to Zero coalition itself was launched again at the UN in September 19 during Climate Action Week. And the UN Secretary General specifically complimented the industry on this initiative in his closing speech. Led by the Global Maritime Forum, the World Economic Forum, and Friends of Ocean Action, and now with over 160 members from all over the world and across the full value chain, and with the support of 14 governments, including the UK, we've been able to move forward on decarbonisation issues, and for the first time witnessed amazing collaboration across the maritime ecosystem. In a way, COVID helped us by forcing us to Zoom far more often than we would have met in person. COVID and the Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal has also helped draw attention to the importance of supply chains and the role of the shipping industry in keeping the global economy functioning. As I mentioned, collaboration has never been better, whether through the energy sector and joint ventures to develop new fuels, or shipyard and marine equipment providers working on designs for the necessary vessels. But there are three key players that need to take the lead. First, the energy and power sectors, who will define the alternatives available for all industrial sectors. But shipping must be involved up front in order to avoid the mistakes of the past. Second, governments through international partnerships, financial support, and empowering the regulators. And of course, third, the cargo owners whose supply chain emissions will become a defining metric. As we've seen from the EU and others, there are several initiatives, but most ignore the role of the IMO being the industry regulator. And that's why COP26 is crucial for the industry as an opportunity for governments to work together to prevent regulatory confusion, which could delay rather than accelerate private sector investment. So let's see what happens over these 2 weeks. And Transport Day next week will probably have some quite interesting announcements. With the support of the UN Secretary General, the Getting to Zero coalition launched this call to action, first to ask governments to commit to decarbonising international shipping by 2050, and in practice to have their IMO ambassadors support that consistent with any agreement reached in Glasgow. You can't have those people agreeing something over there and the same countries going and voting against something at the IMO. Second, to support industrial-scale zero-emission shipping projects through national action addressing vessels, port infrastructure, and fuel production to de-risk first movers, and setting clear targets for domestic shipping, given the fourth greenhouse gas study showing 30% of global emissions are domestic, and thus part of nationally determined contributions. Third, the call to action asked COP26 to help deliver policy measures, including meaningful and equitable market-based measures to take effect by 2025 that will support the commercial deployment of zero-emission vessels and fuels in international shipping, and thus make the ordering of zero-emission vessels the default choice no later than 2030. Yesterday afternoon, on the other side of the river, there was an announcement by 13 governments led by the Prime Minister of Denmark calling for the decarbonisation of shipping zero by 2050 and specifically referring to the call to action being an important influencer on their desire to announce that publicly. They were Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Norway, Panama, Honduras, Hungary, Iceland, the Marshall Islands, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And I'm sure other countries will add their signatures to that call. Now, over 200 companies and institutions have already signed the call to action, and most have detailed their commitments and intended actions. This includes many financial institutions, and Citi, my employer, signed the call to action and is part of GFANS, the Glasgow Financial Alliance, committing to align operational and attributable emissions from our portfolios with pathways to net zero by 2050 or sooner. The role of finance in accelerating decarbonisation of all industries cannot be understated. Citi is also committed to $1 trillion in sustainable finance by 2030, which aligns with the agenda of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This includes financing and facilitating $500 billion in environmental solutions, from renewable energy to clean technology and water conservation to sustainable transportation. I should say that $1 trillion is not just our own money, that's in the capital markets as well. I usually tell audiences that banks have no money to try and stop people coming and asking for it. Or sometimes I'll suggest they go and talk to Paul or one of our other competitors. But I'm pleased to say there's some other people who'll be talking later this morning that you should really go and talk to first. It's good to have some company at the table, as it were. But we still do need to find the final mechanisms, actually, as Maddie sort of referred to find these mechanisms to attract both the equity and the debt for innovative solutions. I think they will be there so that banks like Citi and Société Générale can meet the commitments we have made and for which our shareholders, clients, and regulators will hold us to account. I checked with Maddie that what we're doing in trying to help reduce emissions through the Getting to Zero is not incompatible with ZESTA's objectives, but what we have to do, not consistent, but not incompatible, but what we have to do is to work together on helping finance the zero technologies many of you are working on in parallel with the transition that needs to happen as the energy sector works on transitioning the way in which the industrial economy powers itself. The analogy of much of Africa going straight to mobile technology, having never built a landline infrastructure, doesn't seem likely in the context of international shipping, but let's not underestimate human ingenuity if the willingness and money are both there. We have to find a way in which the investment in true zero technologies is accelerated alongside reductions in emissions through retrofitting or gradual introduction of cleaner fuels, including LNG in the transition period. And that's where the Net Zero Club creates the virtuous circle of investors, lenders, insurers, and cargo owners with governments to create the real-life opportunities for pilot projects on a large scale to show the zero-emission world of shipping is achievable in the time frame needed. The Net Zero Club means that companies will implicitly only work with other companies who have made the same net zero commitment. So that will define suppliers, supply chains, and any other contractual relationship where the emissions will be counted in scope 1, 2, or 3. Zero emission technology, therefore, has a great opportunity to help accelerate any company's compliance with net zero. Let me return to the commodity companies that were part of our initial Poseidon Principles drafting group. As it became clear the banks would be taking a long-term approach through decisions that we commit to with long-term consequences, the commodity companies wanted to take a much shorter-term view so as to be able to manage their chartering decisions and to choose by voyage, if necessary, whose vessels they chartered for their cargoes, but based on the same principles we use in the Poseidon Principles by emissions data the IMO's DCS regulation requires every ship owner to provide for every vessel regulated by the IMO. We heard from Mark Cameron yesterday that an owner under subjects had that charter taken away from it when the charterer saw the emissions data for that vessel. That shows the power of that in a commercial sense. But emissions data will become the defining metric for all of us, and it is that and the common definitions that need to be agreed that will provide much needed clarity for investment and lending decisions. To be clear, Paul and I and our successors do not have a choice. We have to make lending decisions that we believe will keep our portfolios aligned with the zero trajectory and have the data satisfy the outside world, or we will find the capital we have allocated to the shipping industry and our banks is diverted elsewhere. The commodity companies face the same issues. They will be judged by the emissions of the vessels that carry their cargoes. Again, under the auspices of the Global Maritime Forum and led by Cargill and Trafigura, the Sea Cargo, which we talked about yesterday, was launched at the virtual GMF summit in October 2020. The Poseidon Principles now have 28 signatories, representing around 185 or just under $200 billion of shipping finance, over 50% of outstanding shipping finance. The Sea Cargo Charter now has 24 signatories, representing well over 50% of all bulk commodity shipments. And when the Sea Cargo Charter number of signatories overtake the Poseidon Principle number of signatories, I'm sure there will be a press release issued by the Sea Cargo Charter, but there are more charterers than there are shipping banks, fortunately. Ships are usually ordered by an owner or company who believes they will be able to raise the necessary finance at a reasonable cost, and for new vessels using export credit agencies provides the longest tenor debt. The ECAs will have a very important role in the introduction of zero-emission vessels, not just in terms of the hull, but of all equipment. So not just in Asia, the opportunity for technology from many other countries outside the shipbuilding nations is also there. And we've seen that historically with GIEK in Norway as an export credit agent. So it's not just about the hull, it's about the equipment that will go on the ship, which is an opportunity for the UK too. Lenders require a vessel to be in class, acknowledging the expertise and neutrality of class societies, whose word on what is or isn't technically and safely possible will be so important. Lenders also require a vessel they finance to be properly insured. The insurance sector has been working on how it can help influence the decarbonisation of the shipping industry, and there'll be an important announcement later this month, which again will use emissions as a key metric. So soon, owning or operating a vessel will require sharing of data on emissions everywhere in the value chain, and the enlightened owners who've supported the Poseidon Principles and signed the Sea Cargo Charter have recognised that there is only one direction. As was referred to yesterday, the other key announcement 2 weeks ago was the launch of the COSEV, Cargo Owners for Zero Emission Vessels initiative, a new collaborative cargo owner-led network facilitated by the Aspen Institute, where a group of climate-forward brands announced a first-of-its-kind target to progressively switch all their ocean freight vessels powered by zero-carbon fuels by 2040. This group includes Amazon, IKEA, Michelin, and Unilever, as well as several US consumer brands. Their ambition statement sends an important demand signal to the maritime value chain and bunker fuel producers that freight customers want zero-carbon shipping, and they expect the industry to rapidly accelerate its decarbonisation efforts. The reality is that their customers, the end consumer, want this and expect to be able to make environmental choices in their purchasing decisions. Digitalisation will enable people to choose the supply route of what they order, having seen the estimated emissions from that one piece of cargo from factory floor to front door, thus forcing everyone in the supply chain to have to focus on their emissions. You'll be able to track the emissions of whatever you order on this device at some point in the near future. This will influence supply chains, but I also believe that show a decarbonising maritime sector is leading the way. Whether in ancient times or the modern day, shipping has been the enabler of commerce, international trade, and of course globalization. Some of you will recall The Economist magazine a few years ago singled out the container box as the most important technical and process innovation in alleviating poverty in the world through enabling the transformation of global trade. Zero-emission shipping can do the same. Decarbonizing shipping will decarbonize global supply chains and help reduce emissions in every sector whose products are carried by sea, go through the world's ports and into the logistics chains on land. As Bill Gates and others have argued, if you decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors first, the world has a greater chance of meeting the Paris Agreement targets. The shipping value chain now has the collaborative spirit unheard of in the past. Mostly the technology in concept, or as we saw yesterday, actually some of it exists, and the support of the cargo owners who now understand they are also accountable for their maritime emissions. The lenders, investors, and insurers who have signed up or are signing up to public commitments and transparency, and the end consumer who is willing to pay for a cleaner world and support governments in introducing the market-based measures needed. We must remember, though, that the shipping industry is a user of and transporter of energy, and thus must be part of the energy transition, so that the technological solutions that many of you are providing or piloting are taken into account as zero-emission shipping takes shape. We can't have the regulation of the past. We can't have ballast water treatment handled in the way it was. We can't have IMO 2020 ending up with the refineries on board ships. So it's very important that the shipping industry is actively engaged in designing the future of shipping and not waiting to be told what to do either by the IMO or by the energy industry. A report came out last month from McKinsey and Oliver Wyman called Financing the Transition to a Net Zero Future. I read this and wasn't very optimistic, I'm afraid. I also thought it was very poor until I looked and saw that I was actually one of the contributors to it and been interviewed for it some time ago, so of course I changed my view. I just like briefly to read you some of the conclusions because I think they will help in leading into the discussion. I won't be long, Maddie. Their key findings were the innovative blending of capital supported by an enabling ecosystem is needed where different sources of public and private capital are brought together in technology-specific financing blueprints. To do this effectively, mechanisms that activate collaboration among multiple stakeholders are necessary. That's what I was saying. Transformative business models are essential where industry participants and the capital providers work together to establish new contracts, someone said that yesterday, and ways of doing business to increase the probability of commercial success. Targeted public intervention is critical, focused on the design of incentive schemes rewarding early movers adopting innovative technological solutions, and de-risking schemes to mitigate investment risks unique to these innovative solutions. And the panel that follows will give you more detail on how they think that can be done. The report did, however, conclude, not terribly optimistically, that the challenge ahead is significant but not insurmountable. If executed thoughtfully, the mobilization of finance to break through technologies presents a tremendous investment opportunity. More importantly, solving the climate crisis as a global community is the only viable path forward to avoid irreversible damage to the planet. It is imperative to capitalize on this growing opportunity and work together to achieve the net zero ambitions. So let's be ambitious but pragmatic and work together in parallel to finance both the zero technologies now as well as the transition needed for the existing world fleet so that the global economy continues to function as we emerge from the COVID impact on supply chains and bring emissions data to redefine how the world must work to help save our planet. Thank you.